The morning sun streamed through the windows of Rosie's diner, casting golden light over worn booths and the smell of bacon and fresh coffee. The place buzzed with the usual breakfast rush, clinking silverware, murmured conversations, and the occasional bark of a short-order cook. Emma moved between the tables, her expression calm, almost distant. At 26, she looked older than her years, not because of age, but because of what life had etched into her skin. Her uniform sleeves were rolled just enough to work efficiently, but not so much that too much of her arms showed. Still, sometimes a sleeve would slide up just enough to betray her secret, faded, uneven burn scars and a barely visible tattoo, a military unit insignia. This morning it was Table 6 that noticed. A group of young men in crisp suits sat there, city types who clearly weren't locals. They'd been loud from the start, chuckling at their own jokes, flirting half-heartedly with every woman who passed by. When Emma approached with a coffee pot, one of them caught sight of her wrist. He elbowed the guy beside him and whispered something that made them all smirk. Must have played with fire as a kid, one of them snickered, just loud enough for her to hear as she poured his coffee. Or maybe she wrestled a barbecue grill. Emma didn't flinch. She was used to it. It wasn't the first time someone had mocked her scars. It likely wouldn't be the last. She gave a tight smile, careful not to meet their eyes, and moved on to the next table. But someone else had seen what they saw. From the far corner of the diner, a man watched. He was older, much older, his grizzled face a map of time and experience, seated in a worn wheelchair with a navy baseball cap pulled low on his forehead. Frank had been coming to Rosie's diner for years, but today, for the first time, something in the routine cracked. As Emma passed by, the sunlight caught just the edge of that tattoo on her inner wrist. He froze. Not because of the scars, but because of that small patch of ink. His hands trembled slightly on the table. That unit tattoo, it was familiar. Too familiar. The old man leaned forward, squinting, his breath catching in his throat. He hadn't seen that mark in over a decade. Only a few ever wore it. Only those who'd been part of a very specific rescue mission overseas. Only those who had lived through a hellstorm few could even imagine. Frank blinked, his memory blurring the line between the present and the past. He could almost hear the shouting, the chaos, the flames licking the sky, and the desperate voice calling out over the radio that help was coming. He remembered being pulled from the wreckage of a burning Humvee, the smoke choking his lungs, the screams of men who didn't make it. And then her. He didn't know her name then. He only saw her silhouette, small, fast, and fearless, diving into fire to drag out another wounded soldier. The girl had burns all over her arms by the time they evacuated. But she didn't stop. She never hesitated. Now she stood in front of him again, not in fatigues but in a waitress apron, holding a pot of coffee and swallowing her pride while strangers laughed at what they didn't understand. Frank's eyes welled with tears and he sat a little straighter. He wasn't sure yet, but in his gut he knew. The young woman who had saved lives that day had survived, but not without scars, both the kind you see and the kind you don't. And somehow here she was, right in front of him. The breakfast rush had died down, leaving the diner in a soft lull filled with clinking mugs and low conversation. Emma moved more slowly now, wiping down tables and refilling creamers, grateful for the quiet. She paused at the corner booth where the older man sat, preparing to clear his plate. "Excuse me, miss," Frank said, his voice gravelly but steady. "That tattoo on your wrist, may I ask where you got it?" Emma froze. Her eyes dropped to her sleeve, which had slipped back again. Carefully, she pulled it down, hiding the ink. For a moment, she said nothing, debating whether to brush it off, pretend he'd seen wrong. Most people didn't ask. Most people didn't recognize it. But something in Frank's tone wasn't curiosity, it was knowing. She looked at him, meeting his eyes for the first time. "It's from the 317th Medical Evac Unit. I was a combat medic." Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Frank sat back like she'd just knocked the wind out of him. His hands gripped the table edge. "Afghanistan?" he asked. She nodded. He leaned in, lowering his voice. Were you at Kandahar? 10 years ago. That ambush on Route Dagger." Emma blinked. "Yes. I was on the med evac chopper. We got a call about a convoy hit by an IED. Heavy casualties." Frank swallowed hard, his throat tight. "You were there," he whispered. "You were there when they pulled us out of the fire." Emma hesitated, then slowly nodded again. "I remember. It was bad. We barely got everyone out. One guy was trapped in the Humvee. I pulled him free. But the explosion." Her voice trailed off. She didn't need to finish. The burns on her arms said the rest. Frank's hands trembled now, not with age but emotion. His mind drifted into the past, images bursting forward like they'd never left. He remembered the sand, thick and hot in the air. The ground had exploded beneath them, his unit scattered, bloodied and screaming. He remembered seeing the sky through a crack in the armored door, thinking it was the last thing he'd ever see. Then came the voice, a woman shouting, boots pounding, flames roaring. He saw her again, not the waitress but the soldier. Tiny frame, helmet tilted back, eyes fierce with determination. She crawled into the burning wreck, dragging a soldier, Mendez maybe? Free from the fire, her sleeves catching flames as she went back again. Frank remembered shouting for her to stop, that it was suicide. But she didn't. She went in one last time and didn't emerge for several seconds that felt like eternity. When she came out, smoke blackened her skin and she was barely conscious, but she'd pulled out the last man. She saved my life? Frank murmured, more to himself than her. His eyes brimmed with tears. I never knew who she was. Not until now. Emma shifted uncomfortably, unused to being seen this way. I was just doing my job. Frank shook his head. No, that wasn't a job. That was courage most people will never understand. The diner around them continued on, unaware of the moment unfolding in the corner booth. 2 lives, one saved, one scarred, had just collided again in the most unexpected place. And for the first time in years, the old soldier saw a hero not on a medal or a monument, but standing quietly in front of him, holding an empty coffee pot and trying to live a normal life. The diner was picking up again as lunchtime neared, forks clinking, orders being shouted to the kitchen, laughter spilling from booths. Emma continued her work quietly, slipping back into her rhythm, though a part of her still buzzed with the weight of Frank's recognition. She thought that was it. A moment shared, a story revisited. Then she heard her name again. Emma, Frank called softly. She turned. His eyes met hers, still wet with memory, but now steadier, more resolute. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? He asked. She looked down, fiddling with her apron. Because it didn't matter, she said. It wasn't about recognition. I just wanted to help. That's all. Frank stared at her a moment, then pushed his chair back and wheeled himself to the counter, flagging down the manager, a stout woman with a kind face named Marlene. I need you to do something, he said firmly, gesturing toward the room. Can I have everyone's attention for just a moment? Marlene blinked, confused, but nodded. Frank turned his chair toward the center of the diner and cleared his throat. Excuse me, he said, louder now. I'd like to say something. The chatter slowly died. Heads turned. Forks paused midair. Frank's voice was steady but thick with emotion. I know most of you come in here for your coffee and your pie, and maybe you never really notice the woman bringing it to you. But I need you to look at her, really look. He pointed gently toward Emma, who stood frozen near the coffee station, her cheeks flushing with discomfort. You see the scars, he said. You probably wondered. Maybe some of you even joked about them. At this, the suits at table 6 stiffened. The one who had made the worst joke earlier suddenly found it hard to meet Frank's eyes. But what you don't know, Frank continued, is that those scars are the price of saving lives. He looked directly at Emma now. 10 years ago, my unit was ambushed overseas. We were trapped. Burning. Dying. And while the world looked the other way, this woman, barely 20 then, ran straight into that fire. She didn't stop. She pulled us out one by one. She didn't wait for orders. She didn't hesitate. And she nearly died doing it. Murmurs rippled through the diner. Even the kitchen staff poked their heads out. She never told anyone, Frank said, his voice breaking. Not once. She didn't want applause. She just wanted to help. Emma stood still, blinking hard. Her hand gripped the edge of the counter like she needed something to hold onto. Frank turned his chair and locked eyes with the men at table 6. You mocked a hero, he said simply. The scars you laughed at were earned in a war zone, not in weakness, but in bravery. I was there. I owe my life to her. The diner was dead silent now. One of the young men at table 6 opened his mouth, then closed it. The smirk that had once played on his lips was gone. He lowered his eyes to the floor, his face pale and ashamed. Emma didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The room said it all. In that moment, she wasn't just a waitress. She was a soldier, a medic, a hero. And for the first time in a long while, the world finally saw her. The silence that had blanketed the diner began to shift, subtle at first, like a quiet breeze before a storm of feeling. Eyes that once glanced past Emma without care now lingered with reverence. Then, slowly, a man near the window stood. He was older, wearing a battered baseball cap that read Vietnam Vet. Without saying a word, he raised his hand and gave Emma a solemn salute. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Another man, this one younger, in jeans and a worn leather jacket, stood from the back table. He too saluted, then nodded once, hand over heart. It was like a ripple across still water. One by one, the diners responded, not with noise, but with presence. A mother with 2 young children walked up and pressed a folded bill into Emma's hand. "For your lunch," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for everything." A woman in scrubs stepped forward and wrapped her arms gently around Emma, whispering, "My brother didn't come home. Thank you for being the kind who tried to save them." Emma could hardly move. Her body stayed rooted, but her heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in years, recognition not of her pain, but of her purpose. Then came the woman from the corner booth. She was younger, typing away on a laptop, glasses perched on her nose. She stood, eyes wide. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, approaching with gentle caution, "but I'm a reporter with the local paper. I couldn't help overhearing. Would you let me share your story? The community needs to hear this. Kids need to hear this." Emma backed up slightly, shaking her head. "No, please. I'm not trying to be a story. I just do my job." Frank, still seated nearby, looked up at her. "Emma," he said softly, "people need to know what courage looks like. Not the kind in movies. The real kind. The kind that burns and keeps walking anyway." She looked around at the eyes watching her now with awe instead of amusement, at the once laughing table now struck silent with shame, at the quiet pride radiating from the veterans who stood just a little taller in her presence. Tears welled up in her eyes. Not from pain, not from memory, but from something she hadn't felt in so long, respect. She didn't say yes to the reporter right away. She didn't need to. Because even if no headline was ever written, something far more powerful had already happened in that little diner. The world saw her. And for once it didn't look away. The diner looked a little different now. The old wallpaper had been patched up and the corner wall, once blank and unnoticed, now held a wooden plaque titled "Heroes Among Us." Beneath it were framed photos of local veterans, some in uniform, others in everyday clothes. But right in the center was Emma's picture, taken by the local reporter, capturing her smiling gently in her waitress uniform. Sleeves rolled up, her scarred arms bare and proud. Beside her photo hung a small write-up about her unit, the rescue mission that had nearly taken her life, and the quiet years she'd spent serving coffee with no one knowing the full story. The piece ended with Frank's quote, "Real courage is quiet, but it deserves to be heard." Letters poured in after the article ran. Handwritten notes from soldiers who had served in the same region, messages from students inspired by her bravery, and thank yous from strangers who simply wanted to say they cared. Emma kept each one, folded carefully in a small box behind the counter. She hadn't expected it to change so much, but it did. With Frank's encouragement, she enrolled in a local program to train as a trauma counselor focusing on veterans. "You've already done the hardest part," Frank had told her. "Now help them find peace like you're finding yours." And she was. Emma moved through the diner with new confidence. The coffee pot in her hand didn't define her anymore, it was just part of her day. Now, when someone new stared at her scars, she didn't flinch or tug at her sleeves. She let them look, let them wonder, and sometimes, just sometimes, they'd come ask. She always answered. Frank, now a regular fixture at the corner table, smiled every time she passed. He never let his coffee cup go empty, and he never let her forget what she meant to those who had once been left behind. Sometimes they sat and talked for hours about the war, about healing, about what comes next. The laughter from table 6 had long since faded, replaced by quiet reverence and second chances. The men who had once mocked her returned weeks later, each offering a humble apology. One even brought his daughter, pointing to the wall of honor and saying softly, "That's what strength looks like." Emma had learned to forgive. Not for them, but for herself. And as the diner bustled once more with regulars and newcomers, Emma brought Frank his usual black coffee with a splash of cream. She set it gently on his table, her hand steady, her smile soft. "Thanks, Doc," he said, using the nickname he'd given her. She just laughed. "Anytime, soldier." Outside, the sun spilled golden light across the street, and inside, a simple wall reminded everyone who walked through the doors that courage didn't always wear a uniform and heroes didn't always want to be known. She once hid her scars out of shame. Now, they were symbols of a story worth telling. A story of courage, sacrifice, and the quiet power of kindness.